I wonder if we could touch on queens just a little bit. I know Stan Gore asked the question that I wanted to also ask and have you talk a little bit about that too. You've been very open and candid about your preference on having a little younger queens in your operation, and that you go through the extra effort and trying to requeen every year for the reasons that you mentioned earlier. That's the question right there. Stan Gore asks, "Hey Bob, do you prefer post summer solstice queens as far as installs? When do you find that the queens are peak performers?"
Well, after the summer solstice, that would be the best for overwintering. But in my case, any time in the current calendar year is fine for overwintering. Obviously, the younger the queen is going into winter, the better off you're probably going to do. So fall requeening would be better than spring requeening for overwintering. But the current calendar year is fine. I don't think there's much difference for overwintering. Where that really shows up is the next spring.
Mhm.
You know, those late summer queens, they're the best thing going the next spring. Brother Adam talked about that in his book, Beekeeping at Buckfast Abbey. He used to produce queens in late summer, overwinter them in 4-frame nukes, and then use those queens to requeen his production colonies in the spring. And he said those were always his very best production colonies. The queens had low miles on them, if you could kind of compare it to a used car, but yet they were mature. And a lot of people don't understand that it really takes several months for a queen to really catch her stride. You know, it's as if you're comparing it to a racehorse, you know, the difference between a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, there's a big difference, you know. And queens are the same way. They need a little bit of maturity to do their very, very best. And I like to say that they're middle aged by a year and a half or older, and they're not really mature until they're probably 3 months old. And again, back to that, if she's got 2 spring buildups under her belt, then I'd say she's at the top of the hill looking at the other side.
Bob, do you find that those later queens are also a little bit more reserved on the colonies building up on that spring flow rather than building up prematurely and then swarming as soon as the influx of nectar is coming on? Does that hold them back just a little bit with those later queens? I know you raise Carnets and Caucasians, and that helps, but do the later queens help postpone, they help buffer a little bit of that early swarming that some folks may see?
Well, they do, because the younger the queen, the less swarming you're going to have. Like a fall queen will swarm less the following spring than a queen from the previous spring. In other words, if that makes sense, a fall queen will swarm less. But the next spring, if you can put in a queen from that current year, she'll swarm less. It really is, the older the queen is, the more they will swarm. A 1-year-old will swarm more than the current year. A 2-year-old will swarm more than a 1-year-old, and so on. So it's as simple as that. The older the queen is, the more likely it is to swarm.
This is the first year that I did replace some of my queens late in the season. So, and we'll see how it turns out. So
you'll like the results. Yeah,
yeah,
like the results come springtime. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I did 7 of mine. So, yeah, I'm curious come spring, what I'll see, and just overall, how the colonies will look.
Well, the only real drawback to requeening late is it's harder to do it in our neighborhood. Yeah. In the spring when the honey flows on, that's a great time to requeen. You get good acceptance, and if anything goes wrong, they got lots of good nutrition to raise a good queen on their own. And if you're requeening in September and things go south, your options are limited.
Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking on that, Bob, I did a lot of more late season queen replacement this year than I've ever done. I replaced the Michael Palmer queens end of July. Then I just put Greg's in there a couple of weeks ago. So I guess a question I would have is, if you're replacing queens later in the year, do you tend to find that it takes a little while more longer for them to get going in the new colony, or do they just usually not skip a beat? What do you see? Is there any change from spring basically on those queens, or do they just kind of jump in and?
They go pretty good. Of course, it depends on I'm big on this letting the queen lay for a little while before you harvest her and then try to introduce her into another colony.
Sure.
First learned that from Chris Werner decades ago. And if you take a queen that's on a 2-week cycle and introduce her, you'll see maybe a little bit more delay than if it was a more mature queen. But besides that, I don't really think I notice a difference. Maybe I'm not looking close enough, but they both jump in. Yeah.
Well, you've seen so many that I'm sure you know the answer, or I mean, you know what you're looking for on that. I actually, when I did the Michael Palmer Queens, down here in South Alabama, obviously we're a little south of you, and late July and August, early August is like just the most brutal time I think of the year for us here. I
Yeah.
think it is in a lot of places, but that's when I introduced those queens from Michael Palmer, and I had to. I ordered 30. They didn't all take, but the ones that did seem to be doing well. But I ordered 30, and I had to come up with a place for them. It was out there. It was super hot, just trying to figure it all out. And some of them started off with pretty spotty brood pattern, but I think they're kind of catching up now and doing better. But obviously, when you go into a colony in that situation, even if it's a strong colony in that time of the year, they blew through the resources very quickly. They just it was a lot of stress on the colonies, first of all. And then I think, of course, that translated into stress on the new queens. But I've done a pretty good job, I think, of feeding them the last few weeks. And I think they're really catching their stride. And there was a big difference between those queens that I introduced and just the craziness of that time of year. And I didn't feed them then. I wasn't able to get food up there. So it took a little while to get that going. And then when I introduced Greg's Queens a couple of weeks ago, I had fed them the day before. I was actively feeding them, just really had the bees happy. And the acceptance, I think, was better. And the bees just seem happier. So I think that is key, especially late season, that you got some resources coming in. The bees are, I think that's really key. Would you agree with that, Bob? When you replace your queens late in the season, do you prepare the colonies in any certain way as opposed to in the spring?
I understand your earlier question a little better now. I'd like to say that Greg's bees probably just have more love in their hearts, and that's probably why they
Oh,
get better.
Bob, stop.
Is that too corny, Greg?
No, no, it's true. And a lot of them came from your generosity in that visit. And so we've been,
Well, that's been a while, Greg. Those aren't my bees anymore.
that's true. That is true. Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, I use weird terminology. It's like if the colony's fat and sassy and the bees are gorged, you're going to have a lot better luck with acceptance and getting them fired up right away. Pollen is so important for a queen to take off. If the colony is experiencing malnutrition when it comes to pollen, no matter what you do, they're not going to do as well as they would in the spring when there's ample pollen. September, actually, when down here, when we have a goldenrod pollen flow, is actually a good time to put a queen in. It's just that if it goes bad, you're limited in getting the problem fixed because, our drones disappeared early, real early. In years past, sometimes we can still see some drones in September if a colony's trying to raise its own queen, emergency cell. But boy, we didn't have any drones this year. I don't know what that was all about. How about you guys up there?
We had drones late, but we primarily the reason we are intimately in tune with this is we've journeyed into artificial insemination, and so we're working with a couple different lines. And so late in the year, we're out catching drones, Jake and I, to collect semen. And so you are, I guess, to use the word intimately aware of that is a double entendre. But the situation was when we had drones, we had a lot of drones, but what we found is they were still hanging out, and we had plenty to collect for semen. But what we found is they were too mature. When we did get them averted, when we did get the endophallus under the microscope, they were too far advanced, too aged. And then when you actually take a little closer look, a lot of the wings are tattered. They're getting older. They were still hanging on. The bees weren't kicking them out prematurely, but there wasn't enough youth and vigor internally to capture the semen. So while they still were here, the reason it's important to bring that up is, had we not been so proactive making enough queens and virgins in July, August, we would have really been in trouble because there wouldn't have been enough viable mated queens, at least in my opinion, out there to mate those queens. They would have gotten a very poor mating at best, and you really wouldn't have known at first. We would have put them into colonies, even put them into winter situations, to only find they all crash out in January because she can't make enough brood.
Well, even a poorly mated queen can have a good pattern right at first.
At first, yeah.
She sure can. Is that what that gadget behind you is all about, Greg? Is that your?
Yeah, that thing right there is we're trying to keep fine tuning the Caucasian Carney line that we're working on, and that's a piece of equipment that boy, it's like bringing in a completely different trade that doesn't even belong in the same category into it, and learning that and all the detailed nuance, and then figuring out how different it is from everything else. And then you start learning how to start to pair. It's one thing, as you know, to graft and to rear queens and the introductions and all of the risks that you go on with that. But now you start adding a completely different set of skills to that. It's really a challenge, but also rewarding, because we can do things. I think you and I both work with Shibu on some stock, and we've been working with double Caucasians on a couple different lines from Shibu, and brought those back and made a lot of virgins off those. Matter of fact, Bruce, the queens that you got from us were ones that we were holding close to our vests for next year as open mated breeding stock to evaluate over the wintertime, which were daughters grafted off of the double Caucasians, then open mated here with our Carney Caucasian population. So I'll be excited to see, Bruce, what those do for you, because those would be a lot of the backbone that we'll also use and trial out and see how they do, how they downsize, how frugal they were, did they make it through the winter, did they build, and if they get all the check boxes and they've got lower mite counts, then that will be the backbone to continue grafting from. But that is the piece of equipment, Bob, that's that we're using from Apis Engineering to get in there and really make a real serious go at improving our genetics.
Well, for a long time, I thought maybe I'd like to get involved in artificial insemination, and then I went to do that video on Shibu. I cured that right there. I said, okay, I'll just leave it. I need this iron. This is a big iron to put in the fire.
It is
iron in the fire. I'll pay Shibu and people like that to do it for me. And he does a good job. Shibu's good at it.
Right.
I'm happy to let him handle that part of it. So AI is a big deal for us too. We're using Shibu's queens, his artificially inseminated queens, and having good luck with them. And we're like you, we're using Caucasian queens now, breeder queens. And of course, they open mate with everything that's around our neighborhood. So there'll never be anything close to pure
Caucasian mutts. Yeah.
But we like the mix, and speaking of Bruce down there, those are some pretty dark bees. I've heard from some guys that I trusted their opinion that down in Florida that said the dark bees don't do well down there. But what does do well is a mix, like half dark and half Italian, like Chris Werner runs.
Well, my brief experience, over the years, I've just been, one of my things that I've done since I started really was trying different queens from different places. And I've tried everything from the Cordovans to Cordovan Italians to Carniolans to now Greg's, the darker, more Caucasian stock, and a lot of just feral bees right here locally from swarms and such. And to be honest, most of the bees around this part, the feral bees, are a darker bee. They're very dark. However, I'm sure they've got a lot of Italian in them. Most of the time they build up. They're pretty rugged. But they also can be very spicy or quite feisty and a little bit mean on the defensive side. It's not all of them, but I think an overall attitude down here in these Southeast Alabama bees is they're pretty rugged, pretty tough, but also a little spicy. And so my experience with Carniolans and, what little experience I have with Greg's Caucasian-based bees is they do extremely well.
Do they?
They actually, and I've ordered Carniolans from different places in the past, and they've done real well. And then Greg's bees, the Caucasians, I'm kind of new at those, but I know that I think Michael Palmer's are kind of a Carniolan or Caucasian Italian mix, I think is what his genetic line is. I believe. I'm not sure about that, but I am, what they do is they do brew back way quite a bit in the wintertime, even here where, you know, it gets chilly here. I would never say it actually gets cold here, because it really gets cold where those guys are from and where you're from, Bob. It gets cold there. But down here, you know, it never gets really cold, but they'll start to brood back. And, you know, going through winter, there's not much of a cluster and you get worried about them. And boy, coming out of spring, when they decide to turn it on, it's like they just explode up and fill the boxes. And it almost seems impossible how quickly they grow. I remember I had a Carniolan colony years ago, back like in 2014, 2015. And one winter, I thought they were going to die out. They went from a nice big colony the previous year, and they were down into just, you know, 2 or 3 frames in a 10 frame deep. And I'm like, well, I anticipated they would just die out. And it literally seemed like within 2 weeks, I opened that box back up and it was full of bees. Like, there's no way that should be possible because there wasn't that much brood in there. But sure enough, man, they just absolutely exploded. And Sharon says Kona. It was actually Koner. Is it Koner up there?
It's Cohen.
Cohen, yes, Cohen queens.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what it was. Cohen queens. I'm sorry about that. My experience is they've done fine down here, but I'm still learning on that. I kind of like the idea of them brooding back in the wintertime because we have that. I don't know, Bob, if it's the same up in North Georgia, but down here we have almost like a false spring that happens. You know, it'll be about the time the year starts, the first part of January. I think not long after that, the red maple starts to bloom. And so the bees, they really start to build up. And then, you know, they'll be packed out with bees by the 1st of February, just ready to go. And then in February, March, it seems like we have a dearth. It seems like we always have pollen coming in. So maybe that's why they continue to build up, but the nectar just drops off. And so you can starve a lot of bees in February, March here. Yeah. So my hope is that with this Caucasian / Carniolan, you know, line here, maybe it'll help to prevent that explosion that early in the season, possibly. And also hopefully it'll, obviously one of my biggest goals is to improve the attitude, because my bees, I'm tired of working the spicy bees, and I don't mind a little bit of spice. I don't mind wearing a bee jacket, but when they're just stapling your ankles, you know, every time you get in them, and, you know, Grammy midwife Lisa on here, my bees actually ran them out of my yard up there in Ozark a couple of times this year. And I'm like, that's it. If they're going to run people out of the bee yard, and Lisa's pretty tough, but I'm like, I've just got to do something about that. So I don't know what the local bees are. I think they're a little bit of everything. The feral bees out in the trees, and there's a lot of bees. People say bees are almost extinct. Well, not here in the Southeast Alabama, because the number of swarm calls that come in and the number of calls about bees in houses, and it's just amazing, the wild feral bees that exist around here. So,
you know, I think that's happening everywhere. I was down in Palm Beach last weekend, and they said the same thing, just swarms everywhere all the time. And then a few weeks before that, I was down in Slidell, Louisiana, and some of those guys, all they do is collect swarms. They don't treat. They just don't do anything but just repopulate with swarms every year. So there's lots of bees in the swamps or woods down there too.
Wow,
it's interesting. You're right. Maybe the feral bees are starting to work again.